Welcome to an inside look at the regulatory pipeline for medical devices. Today, industry experts break down why treating human factors as a simple checkbox can derail your product. We will explore why relying solely on clinical trials isn't enough, and why viewing the FDA as a partner rather than a hurdle is essential for a successful launch.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to GenUX's first webinar of the season. We're going to do about 3 this year, but this one is with one of our partners, Project MedTech. And today we're going to be working with one of their regulatory team members and their marketing lead, Lindsey, both of whom will introduce themselves right after my intro. We're going to be talking about the regulatory pathway and where human factors fits in. So I am going to popcorn it right now to Kelly so she can introduce herself.
Thanks for having us, Staci. Super excited to have the conversation. I know you and I have gotten to talk through some of these things offline, and it's fun to have the conversation in a more global platform.
Yeah.
My name is Kelly Kucharczyk. I am a principal consultant here with Project MedTech. Been in the industry for around 17 years, always with the new product development, kind of regulatory lens, and joined Project MedTech full-time this year, so in January. So it's exciting to be here. Happy to be talking through an exciting human factors topic.
Excellent. And I'm Lindsey Dinneen. I am the Director of Marketing and Engagement at Project MedTech. My background is in business development strategy and marketing for small businesses. I've done that my whole career, but happily stumbled into MedTech about 5 years ago, found my people in my happy place and never looked back. And really excited that Staci asked if I might consider hosting this. So I do not have the regulatory or human factors background, but I am very excited to speak to the experts who do.
That's awesome. So just a little bit about me, for those of you who've never engaged with anything on the platform for GenUX Consulting. We are a research and design firm. We do specific niche research as well. We do human factors engineering, statistical analysis, and UX, UR. For this conversation today, we're really going to talk about medical devices and regulatory pathways and where human factors engineering, which is a requirement, fits into those, I want to say, pipelines to get to market. So Lindsey's going to kick us off. I'm really excited to talk to you all today. Thanks so much for joining.
So I think let's start by really framing the problem. Why are so many startups still surprised by human factors late in development?
Kelly, I'm going to kick that to you first because I think my answer is going to piggyback off of yours.
It's a great question, and it's one that I think we've scratched our heads on. The reality is human factors is not new. I think FDA's initial guidance document was like 2016, so it's been around for a long time. Usability has been around for even longer, but I think that where I see this kind of fall down with clients is, I know I'm going to reference an old QSR number here. FDA recently has converted to the QMSR, but in the previous QSR, so 21 CFR 820, there was not a specific call out to human factors. There wasn't a direct link in 820. There was always design validation, but it wasn't really explicitly documented what that meant. And so FDA in 2016 and beyond started picking up the pieces and trying to use their guidance documents as opposed to kind of the regulation to really drive the expectation of human factors. I think, ISO 13485 does a little bit better of a job by kind of developing the overarching risk management framework that this all kind of plays in, and they point directly to the 62366 standards. But it still feels like it is something that is either a surprise or something that we find startups thinking that they could just do very quickly on their own.
I think those are both very true statements, and I'm glad I had you start because I am going to piggyback right off of those things. So I think there's 2 pathways that are the problem, specifically with smaller companies, not necessarily larger conglomerates. Larger conglomerates tend to know their requirements and have a regulatory person. One of my best experiences working at Medtronic or even Abbott when I worked at both of those companies was the fact that I worked with someone in regulation, regulatory, and risk management. And I worked with them extremely closely because they knew every aspect of developing a risk document you had to focus on potential user errors. And that's where human factors engineers come in at first. I've seen a lot of smaller startups or smaller mid-sized companies just assume that's not really a thing, and they tend to lump things together into a larger document like a design FMEA, or I mostly see design FMEAs at this point. And what it really should be is a standalone document called a UFMEA or a URRA. And I see that as a miss a lot of the time. Mostly because, again, someone doesn't have someone in regulatory helping them develop a strategy to get to market appropriately. Not at Project MedTech, that's not a thing, obviously, because we all work together. The other thing that I've seen a lot of is what I call fractions and percentages decaffeinated math. So I'm going to call this decaffeinated human factors, where a team member will go, I can read this standard, the FDA guidance, and I'll just do the thing. And there's two problems with that. The guidance is intentionally vague, and it's not vague because of political reasons. It's vague because there's a lot of ways to apply the work when you know how to do it appropriately. And so they want to give the human factors engineering team the ability to do usability testing, aka formatives, where you're forming the product, then get into later evaluations where you're starting to burn down the risk and realize what those risks are if you find any new ones and how to document that appropriately, and then to test those final risks in the validation. People tend to skip all those steps and go straight to validation. And I will tell you this, more and more of the clients that I'm seeing through either Project MedTech or through some of my other avenues of clients, I am seeing a lot of downstream responses from the FDA that are jumping all over the fact that most of these companies are not doing the effective amount of human factors engineering. And this is new. This isn't something that the FDA has been doing a lot in the last 5 years, but in the last 3 years, I've seen it skew this way. And in the last year, I've seen some rough responses from pre-submissions or submissions, all the way to submission, where human factors might have been, okay, we'll allow it because you're a younger company. We understand you don't have a lot of cash flow. That's not happening anymore. So you can get all the way to submission, submit your package to market, and get called out for human factors engineering on, and like kind of get a spanking a little bit. And I feel really bad for these younger companies. But again, I think Kelly and I are onto something. It's either the way that it's not written in the more, I want to say, stringent standards, because ISO 14971, which is also a standard, does talk about it. 6236 came out of the FDA guidance, and it's really for European products trying to come to the market in the United States. So they're kind of parallel with what the expectations are with FDA. And I think those are the two reasons. Yeah.
I would just say, in just thinking through all of the feedback that I've seen come across my desk in the last few years, human factors is a very high hitter. It's consistently one that I'm seeing. So some clients are doing all the right things. They're doing their formatives, their summatives, they're working with really great groups to help get these done. But it's a great point.
Yeah, well, okay, so then based on that, and that was really helpful, thank you. Why is human factors treated as a checkbox instead of a design discipline?
Personally,
Staci, do you want to take
yeah,
this
I'll start
one?
with this
I
one.
feel like you've got strong feelings here.
So I think that there's a combination of things. Like I said, the word guidance isn't helping anybody, but it is what it is, and it needs to be called that. So there's flexibility in how you apply what you need to do human factors engineering. The second thing is, I think that people think when they're developing a product, they're not thinking about a design input versus a design output. An output meaning something that someone interacts with. And when they do think about that, it's more based in, they're going to touch the hardware, they're going to touch the software. Let's just say you have a device that has both of those things. And some kind of engineer put it together, so it has to be right. Like some software engineer put it together, some mechanical engineer put it together. And I've married a mechanical engineer. They don't think like normal people. I'm not saying they're abnormal or crazy or anything like that. I'm just saying, like, people who like to tinker with stuff aren't the normal people in the world. They're not. They're not the end user of the product, and they think that they are. Additionally, design inputs are the documentation processes you go through to create let's just call it a blueprint of the product, which takes you from start to finish to get to market. And I'm like making this very high level, right? Kelly's going to dig in and like get our teeth in and go to it. But I don't think that because the way the standards are written, people consider HF being a design input, which it definitely is, especially early on in risk documentation. So, I mean, that's what I think. Kelly, what do you think?
No, I agree. And I think there tends to be so much focus on the end state. So the disease state that you're treating, what medical condition that you're fixing, and use of the device can get lost in that. And so I think that's why people are like, yeah. Well,
I'll get
physicians
there.
know what they're doing. Like they used medical devices before. And what we really care about is getting this heart valve in or, whatever it is. But it's such a critical component to an effective and safe device.
Mhm.
So I think I think sometimes viewed as a checkbox, and I'm hoping that through lots of these fun conversations, we can start to see that trend in
Yeah.
the other direction.
Yeah, I hope so too. I really do. Because I hate seeing smaller companies get like lost in space and then getting to the end and like realizing they're not there. And like, oh, I have to do another round of fundraising. How much does this cost? Are you serious? And we're like not even that expensive in comparison to the everything else that goes on. I mean, we're not cheap, but we're also not, I wouldn't consider this part of the world expensive when you're talking about
Well,
multi-million dollars.
the bigger thing that I see, bigger risk is, I mean, yes, spending money on human factor studies, that is, there's a cost associated to that, but there's a bigger risk and cost with what if you didn't design the right tool?
Yeah.
And you get it into the hands of the users and it isn't intuitive or it doesn't work the way you think it does. And you have to then go back and make design changes. And that invalidates whatever testing, or maybe not invalidates, but now you're jumping through hoops to justify if you can use the existing testing that you've done, if your clinical data is still applicable. And so I think there's a real need to move this in earlier on into the process for sure.
And then you're thinking about design, like burning risk down throughout design, documentation processes. Like that is a design input, right? So, like those things really need to get thought through, just like Kelly was saying. And yes, I have seen what you're talking about, Kelly. I have seen like the product get all the way to the finish line. They're like, no, it's awesome. Got it. We got this. And then next thing you know, it doesn't pass validation testing on the human factors spec. And then you're like, what? Do we have to like, are we starting over? What does that even mean? And like, then there's a scramble, right? And this is something you can prepare for just by taking a couple of extra steps.
Yeah, okay. And so for founders who might think perhaps that they would like to be able to minimize some costs and they might try to do things more internally, what kinds of results take place when those kinds of decisions are made? Is that even something you can do yourself? Is it smart to do yourself? I mean, I think I know the answer, but it's still like the experts to weigh in.
I'll say it this way since I'm a girl. Can I do my makeup? Yeah. Is it as good as a professional? No. Do I look completely flawless when a professional does it? Yeah. Can I cut my own hair? No. I'm really not very good at it. I've tried it. It's not good. Like, don't do that. So there's those two avenues. Can someone do it if they kind of understand and have a background in cognitive psychology and research? Yeah. Is it teachable by somebody else who knows it? Definitely. Do average people really understand? Not average people. Do engineers in our space that have different vocations, shall we just say, or different specialties, understand how to do the work? No. That's like me deciding I'm a software engineer tomorrow. Like, I understand what coding is. That doesn't mean I can do it. Like, why would I try to do coding? That doesn't, like, when people come up to me that are in these different disciplines and they're like, I really like talking to people, so I'm going to be a human factors engineer. I'm like, yeah, that's like not even a third of my job. Like, most of my job is like, yeah, I do get to talk to people and you get to see because they see the fun stuff, right? They're seeing the research and the exchanges with the doctors, and you get to talk to the doctors and they get to tell you things, and then they get all real chummy with you and they say silly stuff and then you say silly stuff to them. And it looks really fun. I'm taking that data. I have to write a report, right? And so that looks like the fun part. But the parts that lead up to that are the things that get you to that space. And I've been in so many different types of medical devices, not in them like physically, but like physically interacted with them and worked with them, that I can almost guarantee you where something's going to go funky when you go to test something. Um, and that's just the difference between, doing what I do all day for a living, on top of other, and like I said, we do all different types of research. So understanding research as well is kind of important, right? So you can't ask leading questions. What does that even mean? The FDA does define that. And if you read it and you don't understand it because you don't have a background in research, or you think you just want to have a conversation with somebody, your whole study is going to be thrown out. The FDA wants very specific data points to be taken. It's not in the guidance. It's kind of like tribal knowledge that you learn from getting into arguments with the FDA. I wouldn't say argument, strong disagreements. Why are you rejecting this? What happened? What's going on? Tell me the story that I need. So, can you do it? You're not going to look as great on camera. Do you really want to cut your own hair? That's up to you.
Yeah. And I think in the world that we live in, language matters. And talk about this all the time on the regulatory front with potential clients who are like, we're cash is limited. We're like, we get it. We always working with startups where cash is limited. We want to be scrappy with you. My only ask is if you write a pre-sub, don't submit it to FDA without letting someone else who has a regulatory background and experience review it. It doesn't have to be me. I don't care if it's me. It can be anyone. I feel the same about human factors. The language that you're using and the way you're positioning different sets of information, working with someone who's gone through and has a lot of reps under their belt and knows that language by heart makes your experience so much more streamlined. And, a lot of times when you are in the startup phase, especially, I actually, working at Stryker for a decade, the pressure was on even at a large, Fortune 500 company, right? So there's always the urgency to get clearance, to get your approval, whatever your pathway is. And you want to de-risk anything you can in that engagement with FDA. And so having tried and true expert support you, whether that is through strategy or through the whole kit and caboodle of the human factors process, I think it's really important to bring someone who really knows what they're doing along.
Yeah, like I would never try to go to market without a Kelly on my team. Like there's just no way. Like, first of all, I wouldn't make it. I wouldn't even know. Like, hat goes off to the people who are in this space and trying to bring a product to market. It is, I wouldn't call it daunting, but there's a lot of moving parts that you have to like really understand. And if you're new to the industry and you don't have someone like Kelly on your team, you're going to have problems with like submissions and things like that. Like I just recently saw something where the FDA attacked a human factors report, but also went after the risk documentation simultaneously. And the risk documentation error that was in it wasn't even owned by HF. And if you don't have a regulatory person, I noticed immediately, but then I said to the regulatory person that I was working with reviewing this stuff, hey, this is more upstream than HF. There's something else going on. And then she read things that I wouldn't have picked up on, that I wouldn't have known. Like she found a couple of different disagreements that the FDA had with their submissions, and the FDA didn't respond to certain things. And so she found that, and the other company's like, no, they didn't say anything, so we assumed we were good. That's not true. Kelly, look at Kelly's face. She's like, bad sign.
Silence is not acquiescence.
Yeah. So, if you just, it's like you don't know what you don't know until you find out. Like, don't wait till you find out. Go ahead.
Sorry, Staci. I was going to add, just because I got so excited about it, with the advent of AI, this conversation is coming up nonstop. People wanting to use AI to write their submissions, to write their human factors validations. Like, there's a lot of ways you can leverage AI tools. I would say your output is only as good as your knowledge input as well. So you really do have to be asking the right questions in the right way and framing things and challenging it, because AI is not a human brain. There are lots of circumstances where, you see the output from an AI product is, and you're like, wait, that's not right. That missed a whole section, or it points to the wrong reference or whatever. So you need to know enough to challenge things through that process. So if you're trying to stay lean and use AI, I'm not saying don't do that. I'm just saying make sure that there's someone with the experience and knowledge within your team who can check that, whether that's someone you're bringing in from a fractional perspective or a consulting group, whatever that looks like.
Love it. Well, speaking of inputs and outputs, which was a great segue, let's talk about design input versus outputs, and where do they fit into the regulatory pipeline to market?
Yeah, so I mean, design inputs and outputs are at the very start. So you go through your concept development, hit your concept freeze, and your design inputs are really going to be the requirements. So the device must be able to be operable by a physician with a gloved hand or something like that. And then the output is really the solution. So that's where you're saying the physical button that this gloved hand is using has this dimension, as this color, and provides this tactile feedback. So that's kind of really the design inputs and outputs. And from a regulatory perspective, I mean, they fall in at the very start of your development process. You need to be really understanding the problem you're solving from an early stage, right? Like that's the whole goal, right? You find a problem, you want to solve it, and then you have to work through every single one of those requirements. And then how does that actually translate into a device that you can use? And from a human factors perspective, where I see design inputs and outputs, I mean, I would say human factors needs to be considered right at the very start as well. You need to be considering the user. And my example was actually, I think, a human factors kind of focused example where, the user with a glove needs to be able to use this. You really need to be thinking about not just the patient and the disease state, but every step of the process and every single requirement of your product. And that includes as things like your packaging and your aseptic transfer. And is your IFU readable? Is your IFU, does it contain all the right information? So it much more than just, oh, I want to fix this physical, medical problem, and much more robust. So yeah, design inputs and outputs. I know there's always a lot of, I wouldn't say a lot of confusion, but I know it can get a little bit murky if you're not living and breathing it every day.
You nailed it. I'm not even going to have a rebuttal for that one. That was perfect. Great examples.
Awesome. Okay. So how does human factors integrate into risk management?
I'm going to let Staci take this.
One of the requirements for risk is documented in ISO 14971. I have not read it in years, but there are very specific ways to define critical, major, minor, negligible, and I always miss one. Major, minor, critical, catastrophic. The catastrophic one is the one I always miss because I don't like thinking about catastrophic. Catastrophic means termination of life. And those are usually class 3 medical devices. But the point is, throughout that, they're very specifically defined. And those trickle down into every single one of your risk documents, not just human factors, all of them, whether that's a use spec, a design FMEA. We'll just call it a design FMEA, which is a DFMEA, which is the product. And it's a design input that when you write those inputs, the things that you test are the outputs, right? So just kind of explaining how some of the design inputs and outputs work together. With HF, you're required to put together a task analysis. Some people do that separately. I think that that's not necessary. You start building your URRA, which is your use-related risk assessment. It starts with a task analysis because how else are you going to figure out what you're supposed to do in a system unless you write it down physically, right? You have to physically interact with the system a certain way. You write it down. So our biggest component that usually is a live document that lives throughout the whole process because you're supposed to test to it to burn down risk is the URRA. And those stem from requirements in ISO 14971 very specifically. And the FDA guidance actually throws you back to review ISO 14971 when you're documenting risk. to identify critical tasks or essential tasks in the URRA that you will again eventually test to. Hold on one second. So, Kelly, I'll kick it to you.
Where I sit in the kind of cycle on the regulatory side, and I think where I spend more time in this conversation is as helping founders, how it all plays together. I'm not the one in the weeds of the URRA and tying it all together, but I think of 14971 is, that's where you're identifying your hazards and your harms. And then you are through the design process, you're designing the mitigations, right? And I feel like most engineering groups are really familiar with this process, right? You design the mitigations that say, well, we chose this material specifically because it's biocompatible, or we added this safety lock feature so the device doesn't eject a blade, or whatever it might be. And then you get to 6236, which is where you are actually testing the human use, not the clinical use. And I think that there is a lot of confusion in these early stage conversations that I have around, well, isn't that clinical? And it's like, no, human factors is a very different scope and focus. You're testing on the actual users who are going to be using the end device. And if it's an over-the-counter product, it might be a patient. But oftentimes it's a clinician, someone that's working in the OR or in whatever healthcare setting. And that's really your reality check to see if you identified the right hazards, you put the right mitigations in place, and it works in this feedback loop. And hopefully you've done formatives along the way, so you're not getting to your summative and realizing you have a bunch of design changes to make. So that's how I view it, more high level, instead of I think Staci did a nice job of framing out in the weeds how all of these, the documentation and the standards align.
Awesome. So let's talk a little bit about clinical studies. And why do you think founders make the assumption that the user interactions in the clinical study cover human factors requirements?
I think because they both involve users, and the term study is used. I mean, I'm not sure. Once you live in it and you see the difference, you recognize you are really targeting very different end goals with the studies. But I think it's because the device is being used, and sometimes it's in a simulated environment. And I don't know, Staci, what do you think for that one?
I think that you're definitely on the exact path that people think about. It's like, well, I'm doing a study and the users are involved. So if they are successful in the clinical trial, why do I need to do another study? And that doesn't work in an argument unless you planned it that way. So if your regulatory pathway is, let's just say it's a brand new device that changes out an aortic valve. Okay, let's just pretend it's something that's high risk, super new on the market, and there's no predicate, and you had to do a clinical trial and you had to prove efficacy of the product. Well, you're getting what you would call an analysis of statistical power. You have to have a very specific amount of people in that study to prove efficacy of the device. You have a pilot clinical trial, then you have the actual clinical trial. So the pilot goes through first after you get approved from FDA. Then you have to prove even more efficacy because you have to set your statistical power equation up and figure out how many participants, how many doctors, how many sites, how many things. Those are extremely large data sets to support the system being safe and effective to use in the space that it's being used. Not once did I say user is using it safe and effectively. That does come, obviously, because if there's terminations or critical catastrophic situations that happen over and over, the clinical trial halts and stops and you have to figure something out. However, by the time you get to the clinical trial, you shouldn't be seeing any of those things because you've already done pre-rounds of testing. I've never seen any device get to clinical trial on that level and fail. Never, not once. Doesn't happen. If it does, somebody didn't do something or miss some kind of document somewhere along the line, something went wrong, right? So in this case, when you're doing simulated environment testing, you're not doing the actual implant. You're interacting with the user, engaging with the device, and you're looking at how they're actually using it. right? In the clinical trial, you're proving efficacy. You're not looking at how the user is using a device. You can in some small cases, but it would have to be very much documented in the beginning, right? And you would also be testing your URRA against the risk that's already been documented. Most of the time when you are in a clinical trial, you do have documented risk, but you're not testing your design outputs. You're testing clinical efficacy. Those two things are not the same. So if you're not a researcher and I say this to you, that doesn't make sense. What are you talking about? The user's touching it. They didn't die. Obviously, they're doing the thing right. Are you taking that data? Because most of the time, you're not taking that data. And what you find in simulated, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, you're not focused on the user interface in a clinical study.
Definitely not. You're focused on, can this work in this space, in this environment? Are people dying? The answer is usually no, right? People are dying. Oh, people are not dying. You can use this in this space. So it's a yes and a no. When you're doing simulated use studies, you're actually looking at, oh, here is this thing. I'll give an example. This is my cell phone. It reacts to the heat in my finger. That's how it turns on and off its screen, right? It's the heat. So if I'm wearing leather gloves and it's cold outside, this doesn't work. If I breathe hot air onto the leather glove and I hit my phone, it does. Fun fact. Okay, I know people don't do this unless they live in cold areas. There's also gloves that you can get that have this little weird finger thing that make it like interact with the screen. I'm not really sure how that works, but they did the testing and they figured it out. But most of these things are like heat sensitive. That's how they work. You're testing that in an environment. You're looking at that very specific thing to make sure that in cold environments, if somebody needs to get their phone out and talk to somebody, they might have to take off their glove. Or if I'm like cleaning something and I have plastic gloves on, well, I'm going to be able to answer my phone, right? So those things, believe it or not, I'm sure that Apple does actually do these types of tests. And you're looking very specific at, here's a use case. The user's cleaning, they have gloves on, can they answer their phone? It's really cold outside, can they answer their phone? These are things that you're not testing in a clinical trial, right? Obviously, you're not answering a phone in a clinical trial, hopefully not. But you're looking at very specific different behaviors, very specific different integrations of how a product works within a human and how a human responds. That's human response. It's human behavior. That's not the same thing. I know that was kind of long-winded, but it's like, that's the best way to explain those two differences.
I think that was great. That was really helpful.
I can hear my dogs.
It's okay.
My dog is she's sleep barking.
Oh, that's so cute. I thought it was like a wind-up toy, actually. So
no, I should have been faster with my mute button. Would love to ask a quick question to you, Staci. So I was having this very conversation last week or 2 weeks ago, whenever the Midwest Showcase was, and I used the language. I said human factors is micro focused. It's focused and micro focused on the interface itself. And I view clinical trials as more macro. Is this reaching the right clinical outcome?
Yeah.
Is that over? I mean, it's obviously an oversimplification, but does that strike for you? Does that strike as right?
It's exactly, I said it differently, but that's exactly what I said. You're using statistical power to analyze a very large data set. That's the same thing that you just said. And just looking at something very focused, here's the phone that you're testing with your finger. That's micro focused, right? So you're very right in how you explain that. I hope founders understand it is like the bigger thing in general, because we know what we're talking about, right? It's just, do they?
Yeah. Okay. So looking ahead, what industry trends are you seeing when you hear back from the FDA pertaining to human factors and regulatory pathways?
One that I've consistently seen is FDA putting a lot of focus on the quality of the URRAs that they're reviewing. And this is where language really matters and structure and format. There are templates that you can use that are existing within the standard. But I think that's a big piece. And then the other piece is in the world that we live in with digital and AI and devices just becoming more complex. I think that there is what I've seen a couple of times in feedback from submissions for some of these system-based devices is that there is not either a strong enough understanding from the applicant on how this all interfaces together. And so their documentation is not kind of robust enough to cover the entire system. And I think also something that was interesting within the AI realm
Mm-hmm.
is the interface is the safety of the device, right? The way you're building the interface is where there's the most risk. And so I've seen some interesting conversations from FDA pushing back on human factors in this realm.
I agree. Yeah, I've seen that. Plus, I've seen really aggressive responses from the FDA about the lack it's mostly lack of engagement with the URA. The URA is being attacked left and right. I have seen it over and over again. And when we say language matters, what we mean is how you describe the way something is happening or the way somebody is doing something. For example, and I always like human factors, human engineers always use this. How many ways can you tie your shoes? There's like 4 or 5 different ways, right? Depends on how you were taught as a kid. I just want you to tie your shoes successfully, AKA, I want you to complete a task successfully. I really don't care how you tie your shoes. The FDA doesn't care about how you tie your shoes. They want to make sure that you're tying your shoes. They don't want you to fall and break your hip because you tripped over your shoelace. So when you think about when we say language matters, writing how something is done, prescribed, will get you to a failure pretty much every single time because doctors do their own things. That's the one thing I've learned being in this industry for 15 years now. You can expect a doctor to do X, they're going to do Y, and you're like, how did you even do that and MacGyver all that together? They just do things like if they're in a jam and they have cognitive load, which like means a lot of stuff is on your mind, you have a lot going on in your head, and you just need to fix a problem, you're going to figure out how to fix that problem. And doctors have to save people's lives sometimes. Sometimes something goes awry in an implant procedure. Sometimes something goes awry when it was a simple like, oh, you came in for, I have to take your tooth out. Well, your whole gum is now falling out of your mouth. I need to figure out what to do here. They figure out those things immediately and what they do and how they do it. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a clinician. I'm a human factors engineer. I can only go with, they successfully did this thing. So how do I write in the realm of possibility what that looks like, right? I'm working on a knee replacement device right now. And you have to attach some accoutrement, shall we say, to the knee, the bone itself. And we were talking about when I was first on the project, I was like, well, you can't do that many pins. And they're like, yes, you can. And I'm like, but can't that, compromise the integrity of the leg itself and the bone itself? And they're like, there's a certain amount of pins that if you put in, that they're going to be a problem, but these doctors would never do that. And I'm like, how do you know? And we got into these really deep, long conversations. They just got super annoyed at me, right? So the answer is the average is 4 or 5. More than that is probably a problem. Well, how do you write that? The doctor put in 4 pins. No, that's not how you write that. You write that as the doctor appropriately attached the product to the person's body and was able to do the procedure. And that's something you can test. Me sitting there checking a box with how many pins they use or don't use, that doesn't help the safety of the system. And I think that's a problem with URAs. And it's a problem that I see with a lot of URAs. And it's because the people who are writing them, because people don't like to write them, it's just, you're like, please don't make me write them. They're green. And it's not that they don't know. It's just that they've never tested one and had to fail that test and know what that feels like to just be like, oh my God, why didn't I just write this other thing? And it would have covered that. So it's kind of a lack of experience, which again, don't cut your own hair. Bangs are a bad idea. All the men in the audience are gonna be like, what are you talking about? Please. And, you really have to think about the 10,000 foot view of the thing that you need them to do versus the micro situation that they're doing. Those two things come into play, but those are observations that you can take notes on in studies. And I know I'm getting into the weeds here, but if you write a URA incorrectly, it's going to have all the downstream effects. And I mean, Kelly and I have seen a URA that was really functionally formatted appropriately and it was written not completely inappropriately, but it didn't match other documentation that had been created for the regulatory pathway. The FDA gets really on people for that. If you don't have a solid story with your documentation, and if you don't know where HF lives in each parts of those documents, and then you have a standalone function that's doing this thing out there in space, which I've also seen, the FDA will jump down your throat. You try to do a summative test with 8 people, good luck with that. That's a formative. I've seen, these are the submissions I've seen. And I think what's frustrating the FDA, and I think it's frustrating to the FDA. And so if you read 5 bad submissions in a row, can you imagine like what your response is going to be to that 5th one? Because I mean, we're all human, right? And I'm not like saying the FDA is perfect, nothing's perfect, but I do understand, like I've seen some of the things that they've written to people and like they're rough, but I don't disagree with their statements. It's just, you know, you can't read tone in a delivery. So they might feel really bad for these companies, but the things that they're saying aren't untrue. And I'm like I said, I'm working with someone right now, and they're like, they were so mean to us, and I'm like, they weren't necessarily mean because I read your other things, and you had already done this wrong 2 submissions ago. They already told you it was wrong, and you did it again. What do you do to your child when your child continues to do something incorrectly? You kind of get annoyed at your kid, and you're like, hey, why are you not putting your toys away in the bin I told you to put your toys away in? Put your toys in the bin, or I'm going to take away the toy. It just gets frustrating to anybody. That's just how people normally react. So that's really what I'm seeing is like that kind of behavior. The responses aren't necessarily wrong. They're just aggressive.
And I think you alluded to I know what project you're talking about, Stacy. The one where the URI was not wrong, but not right.
It wasn't right.
That one in particular, it kind of rings a bell because we're also seeing a lot more scrutiny from FDA on home use because so many products are now being able to be used at home use or in the home. You know, as we look at mobile medical applications and wearables, and there's a lot of technologies that maybe once were kind of relegated to a professional medical environment that are now being able to be used in the home. And so that's a big piece where I've seen feedback from FDA as well. You know, when you're using your product on your living room couch, all of a sudden the safety net of the clinician is gone. There's not someone there who's like, no, make sure you're sitting this way or you're doing these steps first. And so I've seen quite a bit of feedback on the structure and the content of the IFU and just general labeling as well.
And I mean, I've pushed back on the FDA when they've said something weird that doesn't make sense. I have. I've been like, yeah, no, I don't agree with you. Here's why. And here's this data. And here's why I'm saying this. There was one product I was working on, and they compared this person's device to a diagnostic device over the counter at home versus an actual doctor clinician doing it. And I'm not going to get into exactly what it does, but they compared her diagnostic device to a COVID strip, like that you stuck into your nose. And they were saying, yeah, you can get blood-brain fluid, cerebral fluid into your nose cavity because you stuck the thing in too high. And I'm like, no, you can't. It may be, and they're saying that people did this with COVID swabs. So I'm like, that's so outlandish. They would have pulled those off the market. That's ridiculous. And these aren't even the same users. You can't compare apples and rocks. What are you talking about? And so I'm like, why did you have this conversation with the FDA without, first of all, a regulatory person there? Second of all, at least your HF person. You should have just pinged me. And they were like, I could have called you. I'm like, yeah, I would have beat them up a little bit. This is unacceptable. There's no comparison here. Like, and it cost them $15,000 to do an additional report to prove that it wasn't even true. And like, that's not cool. That's really not cool. And you can get into that situation too with the FDA, and they're not doing anything that they don't think is wrong. They're like, but it's a diagnostic device. And I'm like, yeah, those aren't the same users. And for the record, nobody stuck the COVID test so far up their nose that they were having brain fluid leaking out of their nose. That's such a far-fetched, ridiculous statement. And these aren't like, you can't compare doctors to Joe Blow, me, sitting here doing that when I have OCD and I'm like freaked out that I might have COVID and like I might think I'm dying or something. So, I mean, these are very different arguments to be made. And I'm not saying you can't push back on the FDA. You can't say, that doesn't make any sense. Here's why. But you do have to come to the table with a very even keeled conversation. And here's why I'm thinking this doesn't make any sense. And here's some data for you. And oh, by the way, I pulled this data off of Mod, that post-market data that you make us all like look at before we develop a product. Here you go. It's right there. It's right in your backyard. So you can, like, I've done one or two studies where I did disagree with the FDA and I came with logic, and I didn't go by myself. My whole team was sitting in there with me, specifically regulatory, and regulatory was sitting there cheering me on because we came up with a very structured argument and a very specific approach. And you have to be respectful of when people are telling you you've done something wrong, and then you have to answer to that. And if you're not, the FDA is going to come down even harder on you, by the way. And I've seen it happen, and it's not pretty. But, you just kind of have to roll with the punches and move forward. But I really suggest, at least, if you don't have an HF person, you better have a regulatory person on your panel helping you out, looking at those documents, coming to you going to the FDA with you and having those conversations. Because Kelly and I both talked about, there's nuances to things that unless you have like the tribal knowledge, you just don't know what could happen. And you're so exposed. It's like going to court after you've been accused of manslaughter and not having a lawyer. Like, it's just so silly not to have a regulatory person. Like, that's how I look at this. And regulatory is not going to steer you wrong. Someone who's like, I really want to get you to market. I want to help you get there. Like, let's put a pathway. Let's put a plan together. Definitely, if you're not going to use HF, at least use regulatory. Like, at least use someone who's in that space who can help you navigate.
If you use me for regulatory, I will say we need to pull someone
Yeah.
like Staci who understands the HF world.
Yeah, because you're not going to let them. You're not going to let them fail, right?
Yeah. No, I mean, and FDA at the end of the day, their mission is to keep the public safe, but also to partner in advancing technologies. And a lot of times they push back on things because there is a lack of understanding. We talk a lot about, founders and startups having proximity bias, but FDA has almost the opposite, right? They have, I don't know, however many minutes or hours to review the submission, and they don't have the years or months of background knowledge that you guys had through the development process. And so some of their questions might not make sense. Sometimes, they push on things that you're just really kind of scratching your head at. So there is always opportunity to have a healthy dialogue, and like Staci was saying, go in with your plan, go in with your story straight and kind of your evidence that supports your position. But no, I would always view, and this might not be everyone's favorite statement, but I would always view FDA as a partner. I think
they are
the police or the hurdle, then you're kind of already setting yourself up for, I think, not the right mindset.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. They are your partners. They are really trying to help you get to market, but you have to follow the rules. Just like in anything, you got to cross the T's and dot the I's. And I think that there's been a lot of talk about fake it till you make it. You can do that with some things, but not with devices that can hurt people. That's not where this works, right? So if you're going to release something at like Meta or Amazon and it's not going to hurt anybody, it's just going to irritate the shit out of them when it doesn't work, no biggie. They're just annoyed. Too bad, so sad. You release a medical device that has downstream effects on someone's health that isn't working. That's not the same. So I'll let you think about that.
All right. Well, speaking of thinking of things, so, this has been a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much, both of you, for all of your insights. I would love if you have just one final sort of key takeaway. Like, what's the number one thing you want people to know about human factors and the regulatory pathway?
It's a big question. It's not like a 1 minute. Let me think. Kelly, do you have an answer for that? I don't know. That's big.
Yeah, I think I would say traceability is queen in this world, right? You really need to ensure that everything that all of your great, brilliant thoughts and all of the decisions that you made to get the product to the point that it is needs to be on paper. And I think you need to make sure that all of your documents, your user needs, design inputs, risk analyses, your human factor validation, everything has to tie back together and show the story that you have done the iterations, you've made the right decisions once you got feedback that maybe wasn't, and you've documented those steps along the way. That makes your conversation for FDA a lot easier. It also, for founders, I mean, a lot of founders are looking for a strategic exit. Having that documentation makes your opportunity for exit, I think, that much more real. And it can really be an impactful part of the valuation when you look at how compliant is someone, how well have they documented their design and development process. So it's not just about getting clearance or approval or getting the product to market. I don't know if that was one thing.
No,
it
it was,
feels like
it's right. It's like,
rooted
it's
in
really
one.
about the story you're telling to bring the product to market. It really is like that blueprint, what you have from start to finish. And yes, human factors is a main requirement and it's a major contributor. And it shouldn't be treated as like, oh yeah, I got to do that thing because, oh, I have money now. Don't try something different. Get some funding for it. Think about it in a very different way.
Think about it like you would biocompatibility. Nobody questions that they need to do biocomp anymore.
They just know. Yeah.
All right. Amazing. Well, thank you both so much. I really appreciate your time today and really appreciate the opportunity, Staci. Thank you for giving us this chance to talk about super fun things that everyone should be excited about, right? Of course.
Especially every day, because normal people talk about this stuff all the time.
Yeah.
No, I just want to say thank you guys so much for being a part of this, for being partners to GenUX and having this conversation with us. I'm really excited to do this first webinar with you guys, and I'm sure there's going to be others where we talk about other topics and other downstream effects. But thank you so much for joining GenUX, and we are excited to see the response to all this stuff.